A man has been gone for nearly 5,000 years, and the DNA hidden inside his teeth just shattered one of the biggest myths in ancient history. For more than 2 centuries, historians, archaeologists, politicians, authors, and television documentaries have been locked in a never-ending argument. Who were the ancient Egyptians really? Were the pharaohs African? Were they European? Were they something entirely different? Entire careers have been built trying to answer that question. Books have sold millions of copies arguing one side or the other. Academic conferences have been dedicated to it. Debates have spilled out of universities and into museums, television programs, documentaries, newspaper columns, and eventually onto the internet, where the argument became even louder. Yet, for all the certainty people claim to have, there was one enormous problem sitting at the center of the discussion. Almost nobody had direct genetic evidence from the actual people who lived during the age when Egypt was transforming into one of the greatest civilizations the world had ever seen. For decades, researchers were forced to work with fragments of evidence. Statues were analyzed, wall paintings were examined, ancient skulls were measured and compared. Every side pointed to artifacts that seemed to support its own conclusion. But artifacts can be interpreted in different ways. Paintings are influenced by artistic conventions. Statues are often idealized. Even skeletal remains tell only part of the story. What scientists needed was something far more powerful. They needed DNA. They needed a way to hear directly from the ancient Egyptians themselves, rather than arguing over clues left behind thousands of years ago. Then, a man who had been silent for nearly 5 millennia finally spoke. Not through a royal inscription, not through a forgotten text buried beneath the sand, not through a temple wall covered in hieroglyphs. He spoke through the genetic code preserved inside his bones. His story begins far from the pyramids and far from the Valley of the Kings. Today, he sits in Liverpool, England, inside a museum collection that most visitors pass without a second glance. There is no golden death mask surrounding him, no treasure-filled burial chamber, no dramatic legend about curses and missing explorers. In fact, for most of the last century, he was little more than a catalog number attached to an ancient skeleton. Yet hidden inside one of his teeth was evidence capable of changing how historians understand the origins of ancient Egypt. What makes this discovery even more remarkable is that the man was not a king. He was not a famous pharaoh whose name appears in textbooks. He was not the ruler of an empire or the commander of an army. He was an ordinary Egyptian. And sometimes ordinary people tell us more about history than kings ever can, because rulers are exceptions. Ordinary people represent the populations that built civilizations. For more than 100 years, his remains sat quietly while the world changed around him. Empires rose and collapsed. 2 world wars reshaped continents. Entire scientific disciplines were born. Archaeologists uncovered thousands of tombs across Egypt. Yet nobody knew that one day this forgotten individual would become one of the most important ancient Egyptians ever studied. Then, genetic technology finally caught up with history. Scientists extracted DNA from his remains and began reading a biological record that had survived nearly 5,000 years. What they found was not the answer either side of the old debate expected. Instead, it pointed toward a far stranger story involving migrations, forgotten connections, and links between some of the earliest civilizations on Earth. The evidence suggested that the origins of ancient Egypt could not be explained by simple modern categories. The reality was far more complicated, far more fascinating, and far more connected to the wider ancient world than anyone had imagined. And the deeper researchers looked into his genome, the more they realized that the story of the pharaohs was about to become much bigger than Egypt alone. The man was discovered in 1902 near the Egyptian site of Nuweirat, roughly 265 kilometers south of modern Cairo. Archaeologists excavating tombs cut into the rocky cliffs uncovered an unusual burial. Inside a large ceramic vessel lay the carefully folded remains of an adult male. The burial itself suggested that he had been treated with respect. This was not a random disposal of a body. Someone had placed him there intentionally and with care. After excavation, his remains eventually made their way to England, where they would spend more than 100 years largely ignored. During those 100 years, the world changed dramatically. 2 world wars reshaped continents, empires collapsed, entire scientific fields were born. Archaeology transformed from treasure hunting into a sophisticated discipline. Yet throughout all those decades, one mystery remained unresolved. Nobody truly knew where the ancient Egyptians came from. The debate became increasingly heated during the 20th century. One side argued that Egypt was fundamentally an African civilization created by populations native to the continent. Another side emphasized connections to the Mediterranean and the Near East. Both groups searched for evidence supporting their position. They studied statues. They analyzed paintings. They measured skulls. They compared facial features. Unfortunately, many of these studies were influenced by the assumptions of the people conducting them. Researchers often started with conclusions and then searched for evidence that supported what they already believed. The problem was simple. Ancient DNA was almost impossible to recover from Egypt. Unlike the frozen landscapes of Siberia or the cool caves of Europe, Egypt presents terrible conditions for genetic preservation. Heat destroys DNA. Time breaks it apart. Mummification chemicals can further damage genetic material. For decades, scientists believed that recovering usable genomes from ancient Egyptian remains might never be possible. As a result, the debate continued. Without direct evidence, everyone could continue defending their preferred theory. Then, genetics changed everything. Advances in DNA sequencing began allowing researchers to recover genetic information from ancient remains that would have been impossible to analyze only a generation earlier. Laboratories developed techniques capable of identifying tiny fragments of surviving DNA hidden deep inside teeth and dense bones. Suddenly, individuals who had been silent for thousands of years could tell scientists where their ancestors came from. One of the first major breakthroughs arrived in 2017 when researchers successfully recovered ancient Egyptian DNA from mummies at Abu Sir el-Melek. The results surprised many people. The ancient individuals showed strong genetic connections to populations from the Eastern Mediterranean and the Near East. They did not fit neatly into the categories people had been arguing about for decades, but those mummies came from a later period of Egyptian history. Important as the discovery was, it could not fully answer questions about the earliest pharaohs and the builders of the pyramids. That is why the Liverpool skeleton mattered so much. This man lived far earlier than the Abu Sir mummies. Radiocarbon dating placed him between roughly 2855 and 2570 BCE, directly around the transition into Egypt's Old Kingdom. This was the age when pyramid building began transforming the landscape. This was the era of the first great royal monuments. This was Egypt, at the dawn of its rise into one of history's most recognizable civilizations. When scientists finally succeeded in sequencing his genome, they were looking at something extraordinary. For the first time, researchers could examine the genetic ancestry of an individual who lived astonishingly close to the age of the pyramid builders themselves. The results would not support either side of the old argument. Instead, they pointed toward a far stranger reality. Because the DNA revealed that the story of ancient Egypt was never simply African versus European. It was a story of rivers, migrations, trade routes, forgotten journeys, and connections stretching across the ancient world long before most people believed such connections existed. And as researchers began examining exactly what the genome revealed, they realized that one of humanity's oldest civilizations might have been far more interconnected than anyone had ever imagined. The moment researchers began studying the genome in detail, they realized they were looking at something much bigger than the ancestry of a single man. For generations, historians had treated ancient Egypt as if it emerged in isolation. The standard story was familiar. Small farming communities settled along the Nile thousands of years ago. Over time, these communities grew larger. Agriculture became more productive. Populations increased, and eventually the villages of Upper and Lower Egypt united into a single kingdom. According to this version of history, Egypt's civilization developed primarily from local populations, adapting to one of the most fertile river systems on Earth. It was a powerful explanation, and much of it was true. But the new genetic evidence suggested that the complete story might be far more complicated. To understand why, you have to go back long before the pyramids. Around 10,000 years ago, as the last ice age ended, dramatic environmental changes transformed North Africa and the Near East. Regions that are now desert looked very different. Parts of the Sahara contain lakes, grasslands, and wildlife. Human populations moved across landscapes that would later become nearly uninhabitable. At the same time, some of the earliest farming societies were emerging in the Fertile Crescent, the arc of land stretching through parts of modern Iraq, Syria, Turkey, and Iran. These communities began cultivating crops, domesticating animals, and creating permanent settlements. It was one of the most important transformations in human history. Meanwhile, along the Nile Valley, populations were developing their own farming traditions and increasingly complex societies. Over thousands of years, these communities became connected through trade, migration, and cultural exchange. Long before the first pharaoh wore a crown, people were already moving between regions, carrying ideas, technologies, and occasionally entire bloodlines with them. This is where the DNA begins to matter. When scientists analyzed the Liverpool genome, they found that the majority of his ancestry was linked to ancient North African populations. That part was expected. The man was Egyptian, and most of his genetic heritage reflected deep roots in populations that had lived in North Africa for thousands of years. If the analysis had stopped there, nobody would have been surprised, but it did not stop there. Roughly 1/5 of his ancestry appeared connected to populations associated with the Eastern Fertile Crescent. In simple terms, part of his genetic heritage traced toward regions connected to ancient Mesopotamia, the land between the Tigris and Euphrates rivers. This was not modern Iraq in a political sense. It was the region where some of humanity's earliest cities were emerging at roughly the same time Egypt was taking shape. That finding immediately caught researchers' attention. For decades, archaeologists had noticed curious similarities between early Egypt and Mesopotamia. Certain artistic motifs appeared in both regions. Cylinder seals, first developed in Mesopotamia, eventually appeared in Egypt. Early monumental architecture showed occasional parallels. Most intriguingly, both regions developed writing systems within a relatively short period of one another. Mesopotamia produced cuneiform. Egypt developed hieroglyphs. These were two of the very few places on Earth where writing emerged independently. Historians debated these similarities for generations. Some argued they were evidence of direct contact. Others believed the similarities resulted from parallel development. Most preferred a cautious middle position. Ideas may have traveled between the regions, they argued, but people themselves probably did not move in large numbers. The genome complicated that explanation, because genes do not travel on their own. If ancestry connected to populations from the Eastern Fertile Crescent appeared in an Egyptian living near the age of the pyramid builders, then at some point real people had moved between those worlds, not just traders exchanging goods, not just stories passing from one region to another. Actual human beings had traveled, settled, married, and become part of the population that would eventually build ancient Egypt. The timing makes the discovery even more fascinating. The man lived during one of the most important periods in Egyptian history. This was the era when the foundations of pharaonic civilization were solidifying. The great state institutions were expanding. Monumental construction projects were beginning to reshape the landscape. Administrative systems were becoming increasingly sophisticated. Egypt was transforming from a young kingdom into one of the most powerful civilizations on Earth. At nearly the same moment, Mesopotamia was experiencing its own extraordinary rise. Cities such as Uruk, Ur, and Eridu were growing into major urban centers. Complex governments were emerging. Writing systems were being refined. Long-distance trade networks stretched across vast regions. Two of humanity's earliest civilizations were developing simultaneously, separated by more than 1,000 kilometers, yet increasingly connected, through evidence that continues to surprise researchers. And once scientists realized that these connections existed in the DNA itself, a much larger question emerged. If the builders of early Egypt carried traces of ancestry linked to regions far to the east, then how extensive were the connections between these ancient civilizations? Were they isolated societies that occasionally exchanged ideas, or were they part of a much larger network of movement, trade, and migration that historians are only now beginning to understand? The answers may be hidden in clues that archaeologists have been uncovering for more than a century without fully realizing what they were looking at. The answers may have been sitting in museums, excavation reports, and archaeological journals for more than 100 years. The strange thing is that none of the clues were actually hidden. Archaeologists had been finding them for generations. The problem was that each clue by itself seemed too small to change history. A carved object here, a design pattern there, a seal impression on a piece of clay. Viewed separately, they looked like isolated curiosities. Viewed together, especially after the DNA evidence emerged, they began to tell a very different story. One of the earliest clues came from Egypt's pre-dynastic period, the centuries before the first pharaoh unified the kingdom. During this time, objects began appearing in Egyptian sites that looked surprisingly familiar to archaeologists studying Mesopotamia. Among the most famous were cylinder seals. These small carved cylinders were rolled across wet clay to leave detailed impressions. In Mesopotamia, they functioned almost like signatures or official stamps. They were already common in cities such as Uruk long before they appeared in Egypt. Yet suddenly, similar objects began showing up along the Nile. For decades, researchers debated what that meant. The traditional explanation was simple. Trade, a merchant travels. Goods change hands. Exotic objects arrive in foreign lands. End of story. But as more evidence accumulated, the explanation became harder to maintain. It was not just the objects themselves. Certain artistic styles also appeared unexpectedly. Some of the earliest Egyptian royal imagery contained motifs that looked strikingly similar to designs seen in Mesopotamian art. One of the most famous examples appears on the Narmer palette, one of the most important artifacts in Egyptian history. The Narmer palette dates to around 3100 BCE and commemorates the unification of Egypt under King Narmer. Near the center of the artifact appear two strange, long-necked creatures with intertwined necks. These animals do not belong to traditional Egyptian artistic traditions. Yet similar creatures appear repeatedly in Mesopotamian imagery. Archaeologists noticed this similarity decades ago, but without direct evidence of population movement, many dismissed it as artistic influence passing through trade networks. Then there was architecture. Early Egyptian ceremonial structures and elite buildings sometimes displayed design features remarkably similar to techniques already established in Mesopotamia. Certain recessed wall patterns, decorative niches, and construction styles appeared in both regions. Again, scholars often explain these similarities as borrowed ideas rather than evidence of migrating people. After all, ideas can travel much farther than populations, or so they thought. The genome from Liverpool forced researchers to reconsider that assumption. Because once actual genetic connections appear, every old clue suddenly looks different. The cylinder seals are no longer just imported objects. The artistic motifs are no longer isolated coincidences. The architectural similarities become part of a larger pattern. Instead of asking whether ideas traveled between Mesopotamia and Egypt, researchers began asking whether families, craftsmen, traders, and entire communities may have moved as well. What makes this possibility especially fascinating is that ancient trade networks were already far more extensive than most people realize. Even before the pyramids were built, Egyptians were importing materials from remarkable distances. Lapis lazuli, one of the most prized stones in the ancient world, originated primarily in what is now Afghanistan. That is more than 3,000 kilometers from Egypt. Obsidian, copper, gold, timber, and exotic stones moved across vast regions long before formal empires existed. Every object required human beings to transport it. Every trade route required people who understood multiple regions, multiple cultures, and multiple languages. Trade does not create empty roads. It creates movement, and movement creates contact. Over generations, contact creates families. This is where the DNA becomes so important. The Liverpool man was not a foreign visitor who happened to die in Egypt. Scientists analyzed chemical signatures preserved inside his teeth, specifically isotopes formed during childhood. These isotopes act almost like geographical fingerprints. They reflect the water a person drank and the food they consumed while growing up. The results were clear. He had spent his childhood in Egypt. He was raised on Egyptian soil. He was not an immigrant from Mesopotamia. That discovery changed everything, because it means the Eastern ancestry found in his genome did not belong to him alone. It belonged to earlier generations. His parents, grandparents, or even more distant ancestors had already become part of Egyptian society. By the time he was born, the migration had already happened. The foreign bloodline had become Egyptian. And that raises an even bigger question. If this man carried ancestry connected to Mesopotamia while living near the age of the pyramid builders, how many other Egyptians carried similar connections? Was he unusual? Or was he part of a much larger pattern that scientists are only beginning to uncover? The deeper researchers investigate, the more they realize that Egypt may never have been the isolated civilization people imagined. It may have been part of a vast corridor of movement linking North Africa, the Levant, and Mesopotamia long before history was written down. And if that is true, then the story of the pharaohs is not just the story of Egypt. It is the story of how entire civilizations became connected at the very dawn of human history. It is the story of how entire civilizations became connected at the very dawn of human history. And the most surprising part is that the man at the center of this discovery was not a king, a priest, or a famous ruler whose name appears in history books. He was an ordinary Egyptian. That may be the most shocking fact of all. When people imagine ancient DNA changing history, they usually picture a pharaoh's tombs, a golden sarcophagus, or some spectacular royal burial hidden beneath the desert. That is not what happened here. The individual whose genome helped transform this debate was likely a working man. The evidence preserved in his skeleton tells a story that is almost the opposite of royal luxury. Scientists carefully examined his bones and found signs of years of physical labor. His joints showed wear. His spine carried evidence of repetitive movement. Certain areas of the skeleton suggested that he spent long periods leaning forward and performing the same tasks again and again throughout his life. Researchers proposed several possibilities, but one interpretation attracted particular attention. The wear patterns resembled those often associated with pottery production. The skeleton also revealed something else remarkable. He lived to an unusually old age for his era. Researchers estimated that he was over 60 years old when he died. That might not sound extraordinary today, but in ancient Egypt, it was rare. Life was hard. Disease was common. Accidents were frequent. Most people never reached old age. Yet somehow this man survived decades of physical work and lived long enough to become an elder in his community. Using advanced forensic reconstruction techniques, researchers at Liverpool's Face Lab digitally rebuilt his appearance. Starting with detailed scans of the skull, specialists reconstructed muscles, skin thickness, and facial features layer by layer. The result surprised many people expecting some dramatic revelation. The face that emerged looked completely ordinary, not a conqueror from a distant land, not an exotic outsider, not a mysterious traveler from Mesopotamia. The kind of face that could have walked through a marketplace on the Nile without attracting a second glance. That ordinary appearance is precisely what makes the discovery so powerful. For generations, people argued about ancient Egypt as if populations existed in neat categories: African, European, Middle Eastern. The genome revealed something much more complicated. Human beings rarely fit into simple boxes. Ancient populations mixed, moved, and interacted continuously. By the time civilizations appeared, many communities already carried ancestries shaped by thousands of years of migration. And this is where the story becomes even more controversial. For decades, some researchers believed that similarities between Egypt and Mesopotamia were largely the result of cultural exchange. Ideas traveled, technologies traveled, religious concepts traveled, but people themselves remained mostly where they were. The genetic evidence now challenges that assumption. The Liverpool genome provides direct proof that ancestry connected to populations from the Fertile Crescent had already entered Egypt during the period surrounding the rise of the pyramids. That does not mean Egypt was founded by Mesopotamians. It does not mean Sumerians arrived and created Egyptian civilization. But it does mean that the populations who built ancient Egypt were connected to a wider world than historians once believed. Ancient DNA studies across Europe, Asia, and the Near East keep revealing the same lesson. Populations that archaeologists once viewed as separate often turn out to be connected. Bronze Age migrations reshaped Europe. Steppe populations spread across enormous distances. Communities thought to be isolated exchanged genes, technologies, and traditions over centuries. Again and again, genetics has shown that ancient people were far more mobile than anyone imagined. That conclusion fits remarkably well with what archaeology has been revealing for decades. The similarities between Egypt and Mesopotamia were real. The trade routes connecting the Nile, the Levant, and the Fertile Crescent were real. The movement of materials, technologies, and artistic influences was real. Now, genetics has added another layer to the picture. People move too. For nearly 5,000 years, he sat silently inside a clay vessel while generations argued about who his people were. Empires rose and fell, kingdoms disappeared, entire civilizations were forgotten. Yet inside his teeth and bones, the evidence remained waiting for someone to discover it. Not a civilization belonging entirely to one continent or another,